I'm Mordechai Cohen, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second meeting of the Chinese-Jewish Conversation at Yeshiva University. Dajia hao, wan shang hao, wo shi kong mu ren. 今天我们是第二次开会，中国人和犹太人之间的对话。We're privileged this evening to hear from Professor Roger Ames of Beijing, a world scholar of Confucian thought. Yeshiva University is a Jewish university committed to our sacred ancient traditions. Yet since the day of its founding, YU has been outward-facing to engage with the world around us under the rubric of Torah Umada, Jewish and general learning. In the 21st century, the world has become smaller as global networks and connections abound. It's time to explore the Chinese and Jewish traditions comparatively. 非常欢迎亲爱的中国学生们，很高兴你们参加我们的会议。There are two parts to the program this evening. I'll speak briefly myself about the Jewish tradition, our sacred classical texts, the Bible, the Talmud, and generations of commentaries. And next, Professor Ames will present his philosophical interpretation of the Confucian classics, and his interpretation is deeply influential in China today. One of my goals will be to frame Professor Ames' lecture so that the audience will appreciate his remarkable achievements in developing a world philosophy. This is a book that was written about the philosophy of Professor Ames by leading Confucian scholars today. And it's not the only one. A number of studies have engaged with Professor Ames. And the title is here what I wanted to reference, Appreciating the Chinese Difference. Okay, we are different, we come from different perspectives. And this encapsulates Professor Ames' philosophy. In the spirit of Torah Umada, I'd say that the challenges of learning about a foreign tradition are worth facing because we gain so much by seeing our own world from new perspectives. And the audience today is a Chinese and Jewish audience, and that's the conversation that I'm talking about. Like the Chinese, we as Jews venerate our classical ancient texts. Around the time that the five classics, the Wu Jing of the Confucian canon, crystallized, our Bible, the Tanakh, was canonized by Ezra HaSofer and the men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. But this was only the beginning of the story. Our rabbis engaged in midrashic interpretation of the Bible to produce the system of Jewish law and norms of behavior. The Bible is a closed text for us now, but the gates of interpretation were never closed, to borrow a term that our great sage Maimonides used in the 12th century. The sages of the Talmud, followed by the medieval interpreters known as the Rishonim, the early ones, sought to interpret the Word of God, both in its original sense and as a guide for contemporary life. It was during the medieval period that Jewish philosophy emerged out of an engagement with Greco-Arabic philosophy. While certain theological dogmas and doctrines are implicit in the Talmud and Midrash, systematic Jewish philosophy was pioneered by Saadia Gaon in the 10th century and refined by Maimonides in the 12th century. Those Rishonim both wrote in Arabic and interpreted Judaism in response to the Muslim cultural world around them. In the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the towering intellectual figure of Yeshiva University, formulated a novel Jewish philosophy for modern times. Rabbi Soloveitchik was trained as a neo-Kantian and was influenced by a range of 19th and early 20th century German thinkers. His approach differed from Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, who interpreted Judaism using Greco-Arabic philosophical categories. Rabbi Soloveitchik, on the other hand, used his philosophical analytic training to define Judaism on its own terms, with the halakha, the Jewish law, being central. Yeshiva University stands for modern orthodoxy, the need we have as traditional Jews to engage with the world around us. We recognize that Judaism today isn't what it was 100 years ago, or 800 years ago in the time of Maimonides, or 2,000 years ago, 2,400 years ago in the time of Ezra HaSofer. But actually modern Orthodoxy isn't modern at all, because this ability and necessity to adapt is built into our Jewish religious tradition. The Jewish audience here is familiar with the different interpretive epochs in our tradition. The Talmud, the Rishonim of the medieval period, and the Achronim, the later ones of the early modern and modern periods. The Chinese classics likewise have long and complex interpretive traditions. Commentaries throughout the generations addressed influences of society, both internal and external. During the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279, for example, Chinese intellectuals, under the influences of Buddhism and Taoism, gave new attention to metaphysical big questions that were not prominent in earlier Confucianism. In the 19th century, the Confucian texts were translated by missionaries who gave the Chinese concept Christian overtones. In the 20th century, many Confucian scholars, even Chinese scholars, interpreted the ancient texts in light of modern Western philosophy. Roger Ames, on the other hand, argues for giving the Chinese texts their own voice without appealing to Christian or even Western philosophical categories. Although an expert in Chinese philology and the history of Chinese interpretation, Professor Ames' goal is not simply to capture the original intention of the ancient texts. He strives to give them a new interpretation that has meaning for our lives in the 21st century.